The women who survived the Great Depression didn't have freeze-dried meal kits. They didn't have a 30-day emergency food bucket from some online survival store. They had a wood stove, a cracked ceramic bowl, and enough grit to stretch a single ham bone into 4 days of meals. And, here's the thing. They did it better than most modern preppers ever could. What they knew, you've almost certainly forgotten. What they practiced, the food industry spent decades convincing you was unnecessary. This is the knowledge that kept families of 8 alive when the whole economy collapsed around them, and every single trick still works today. Let's set the stage. By 1933, unemployment in the United States had hit nearly 25%. That's 1 in 4 working adults with no paycheck. Soup lines stretched around city blocks. Farm families who grew food couldn't sell it because nobody had money to buy. Entire rural communities survived not because they stockpiled, but because they knew things. Deep, practical, generational knowledge about food that no algorithm could replicate. The families that made it weren't lucky. They were skilled. They understood something that modern emergency preparedness marketing completely misses. Surviving a food crisis isn't about having the most stuff. It's about knowing how to extract maximum value from the least amount of ingredients. That's a mindset, a craft, and it started in the pantry. Compare that to today. The modern prepper market is booming. Companies sell emergency food buckets promising 2,000 calories a day for 30 days. Packed with sodium-heavy freeze-dried meals that cost hundreds of dollars and taste like cardboard reconstituted in regret. These products have their place, but they also create a dangerous illusion. That preparedness is something you buy, not something you learn. Your great-grandmother would have seen right through that sales pitch. Here are 7 pantry tricks from the Great Depression era that genuinely fed large families on almost nothing, and still hold up in any real crisis today. Trick 1. Dripping on bread was not poverty food, it was strategy. Before the Depression, working-class families already knew the value of dripping, the rendered fat left behind after cooking meat. When the economy collapsed and meat became a luxury, dripping became currency. A small piece of pork belly, a lamb chop, even a cheap cut of beef. Once cooked, the pan wasn't wiped clean. That golden, salted fat was poured into a ceramic jar and kept cool. It hardened into a spreadable paste that went onto bread, toast, or flatbreads, and provided dense caloric fuel. This matters more than it sounds. Dripping on a thick slice of bread could deliver between 300 and 400 calories in a single serving. For a child doing farm chores or a man doing manual labor, that was enough to function for hours. Families of 8 didn't eat 3 full meals. They ate strategically timed, high-calorie portions that kept energy levels stable without wasting food. The modern equivalent would be something like coconut oil or clarified butter on bread, and both work. But the Depression-era understanding was more nuanced. They matched the fat to the available bread, salted it correctly to enhance preservation, and served it in portions calculated to get everyone through the morning. That's not desperation, that's precision nutrition before the term existed. In any grid-down or economic collapse scenario, understanding how to use fats as a caloric anchor could mean the difference between a family that functions and one that doesn't. Trick 2. The bone broth cycle that never ended. Here's something that would horrify a modern grocery shopper. Depression-era families boiled the same bones multiple times. A chicken carcass didn't get 1 boil, it got 3 or 4, each time producing a progressively lighter broth that still carried minerals, gelatin, and flavor. Nothing was wasted. Absolutely nothing. This perpetual broth method, sometimes called everlasting soup in old homesteading records, was a real practice. A pot of broth stayed on the back of the stove for days. Each day scraps went in, vegetable peels, wilted greens, leftover grain, a handful of dried beans. Each day a portion came out as the base for a meal. The broth stretched everything. It transformed a small amount of grain into a hearty porridge. It turned leftover bread into filling soup. It made a nearly empty pantry feel abundant. The nutritional science behind this is sound. Long-simmered bones release collagen, calcium, and phosphorus into the liquid. The broth itself carries enough mineral content to support basic body function over extended periods. During the Depression, this wasn't health food marketing. Shovel. Geometry. How do you feed 8 people with very little? You add liquid, you add heat, and you make everything bigger and more filling than it actually is. In a modern crisis, this technique is immediately applicable. A bag of chicken bones from your freezer, some vegetable scraps you'd normally throw away, a few hours on low heat, you have a base that can anchor every meal for days. It costs almost nothing. It requires no electricity if you have a camp stove or open fire, and it works. Trick 3. Sugar and lard were preserved like gold. You know, Depression-era pantries didn't look anything like the ones we have today. There were no rows of colorful cans or those vacuum-sealed snack bags. Instead, you'd find simple, dense staples: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, sugar, and lard. These weren't just ingredients, they were, honestly, the entire architecture of survival. Sugar and lard served a preservation function that most people today have, well, completely forgotten. Sugar was used to preserve fruit in jams and fruit butters, which could be sealed in jars and stored for months without any need for refrigeration. Lard was used to seal the tops of jars after canning, creating an airtight barrier that kept food from spoiling. And lard wasn't just for food, it was rubbed on cast iron to prevent rust, used to waterproof leather boots, and even applied to dry skin during the winter. It was, really, a multi-tool in solid fat form. The deeper lesson here is that Depression families understood their staples had multiple functions. Sugar wasn't just a sweetener, it was a preservative. Lard wasn't just cooking fat, it was a sealing agent, a lubricant, a skin protector. When you understand all the functions of your basic pantry items, your food storage becomes, well, dramatically more efficient. You're not stockpiling single-use products, you're stockpiling tools. Modern preppers often fall into the trap of buying specialty items: dehydrated butter, powdered cheese, flavored protein packets, when the real power is in understanding what simple, inexpensive staples can do when you know how to use them fully. A 50-pound bag of sugar and a tub of lard, properly stored, can do more work in a crisis than most emergency kits that cost 10 times as much. Trick 4. Root cellaring was the original refrigerator. Before electricity became standard in rural American homes, families had root cellars. These were simple underground or partially underground storage rooms, often just a dugout corner of a basement or a pit in a hillside. Provide and maintain temperatures between 32 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, thanks to the natural insulation of the earth. In these cellars, families stored carrots, potatoes, turnips, beets, cabbage, apples, and cured meats for months without any power at all. During the Depression, root cellaring wasn't some homesteading hobby, it was the reason families didn't starve in winter. A family that had properly stored a good harvest in October could eat right through February without buying a single item. The variables were simple, consistent cool temperature, darkness, humidity control, and separation of ethylene-producing fruits from vegetables. Apples, for example, produce ethylene gas that causes surrounding vegetables to ripen and rot faster, so they were always stored separately. This knowledge, honestly, has an incredibly direct modern application. You don't need a full underground cellar to apply root cellaring principles. A cool closet, a garage corner in a mild climate, a buried cooler, or even a dedicated section of a basement can replicate the conditions. In an extended grid-down situation, root cellaring is one of the few food preservation methods that requires zero energy input after the initial setup. That's a level of resilience no freeze-dried bucket can match. Trick 5. Stretching flour to its absolute limit. During the Great Depression, flour was stretched in ways that, honestly, would seem extreme today. Biscuits were made with less fat than any modern recipe would call for, and still turned out edible because, well, the technique compensated for the missing ingredient. Bread was extended with cornmeal, oats, or even potato water. That's the starchy liquid left after boiling potatoes, which added bulk, moisture, and subtle nutrition without requiring more flour. Potato water bread was particularly clever. Boiling potatoes releases starch into the water, and that starchy liquid, when added to bread dough, produces a loaf that rises better, stays moist longer, and, believe it or not, goes further per slice. Depression-era bakers discovered this not through food science journals, but through pure necessity, and the technique has since been validated by professional bakers who recognize that potato water actually activates yeast more efficiently than plain water. The broader principle here is caloric stretching through starch-on-starch layering. Add potato to bread, add bread to soup, add soup to beans. Each layer extends the caloric reach of the layer before it. A family of 8 wasn't eating 8 separate full portions of everything. They were eating a carefully layered meal architecture designed to make every calorie count and every ingredient appear in multiple places at once. Trick 6. Communal cooking rotation changed everything. This one, honestly, gets overlooked in most survival discussions because it doesn't fit the individualistic prepper narrative, but, it may be the most powerful trick on this list. Depression-era communities, especially in rural areas, practiced communal cooking rotation. Neighbors took turns cooking large batches. One household with an abundance of dried beans would cook a massive pot. Another with flour would bake bread. A third with vegetables would contribute to a shared stew. This wasn't charity, it was an efficiency system. Cooking one large pot of beans for 20 people uses dramatically less fuel than 20 households cooking small individual portions. It reduces the frequency of fire starting in winter, which conserved wood and prevented chimney accidents. It pooled the labor of cooking into shared work, freeing other family members for farming, childcare, or repair work. And it created a community accountability structure where everyone's contribution was visible, which reduced waste and increased collective resourcefulness. Modern preppers almost universally plan as isolated units. One family, one bug-out bag, one food supply. But the historical record is clear. Communities that shared resources and labor survived the Depression at far higher rates than isolated households that hoarded. The psychological resilience of communal cooking also shouldn't be underestimated. Eating together, even through hardship, maintained morale in ways that solitary survival never could. If economic collapse came tomorrow, the neighborhood you build relationships with before the crisis matters more than the supplies you stockpile alone. That's not a soft sentiment. It's documented Depression-era history. Trick 7. Making everything taste like enough. The final trick is psychological, but it's rooted in real culinary practice. Depression-era cooks became masters of seasoning, not because they had access to exotic spices, but because they understood that flavor signals satisfaction to the brain, and satisfaction reduces the urge to overeat. A deeply seasoned broth, even if it contained very little actual substance, felt filling because it activated the full range of taste receptors. Salt, vinegar, and wood smoke were the 3 primary flavor tools of the Depression kitchen. Vinegar brightened dull ingredients and made preserved foods more palatable over time. Salt enhanced almost everything. Wood smoke, used in meat preservation and in some communal cooking setups, added a depth of flavor that made simple foods feel substantial. The goal was never to trick anyone. It was to make modest food genuinely satisfying, which in turn made smaller portions feel adequate. This principle translates directly to any emergency food plan. A well-seasoned, simple meal will sustain morale better than a technically nutritious but flavorless one. Stock salt, vinegar, and basic spices in your emergency pantry, not as luxuries, but as psychological infrastructure. They weigh almost nothing, cost almost nothing, and last for years. They are, in the truest depression sense, worth their weight. What your great-grandmother knew that nobody's selling you. Here's the uncomfortable truth that the emergency food industry doesn't want you sitting with. Preparedness has never been about products. The families that fed 8 people on almost nothing during the worst economic collapse in American history did it with knowledge, community, and a deeply practical understanding of how food actually works. They knew how to extract every calorie from every ingredient. They knew how to preserve without power. They knew how to build community systems that multiplied individual resources. They knew how to make modest food feel like enough. And they passed none of it down because the post-war boom told them it was no longer necessary. It is necessary. It always was. The next crisis, economic, environmental, or otherwise, won't care how many freeze-dried buckets are stacked in your garage. It will care whether you know how to use what you have, stretch what you've got, and build the kind of community that multiplies everyone's chances of making it through. Your great-grandmother could outlast any modern prepper. The question is whether you're willing to learn what she knew before you need it.